In the spring of 2015, one American company dumped 8 million gallons of ice cream into a landfill. Not because the market had turned, not because a competitor had undercut them, but because inside their own factories they had operated for over a century, a silent killer had been breeding in the cold, lurking in the machinery, spreading through the drains for 5 uninterrupted years. Walk into any grocery store in Texas during the 1990s, and you would understand immediately what Blue Bell meant to people. Not just a brand, not merely a product. You would see the half-gallon cartons, white with that unmistakable logo of a little girl leading a cow, stacked row upon row in the freezers. You would hear customers talking about it the way they talked about family. You would see the pride. By 2014, Bell Creameries was the single best-selling ice cream brand in the entire United States. Not Haagen-Dazs, not Breyers. Blue Bell, a privately held company from a town of fewer than 17,000 people in the Texas Hill Country, operating in only 20% of the nation's grocery stores, commanding over half the ice cream market in its home state. They called themselves the Little Creamery in Brenham. Texans called them family. Forbes magazine in 2001 called them the best ice cream in the country. Then, something went catastrophically wrong. People died. 8 million gallons were destroyed. Over 1,400 workers lost their jobs. Federal prosecutors came knocking. And the company that had survived 108 years without a single recall faced the very real possibility of permanent extinction. So how does a beloved institution, one built on the promise of purity and quality, end up concealing a deadly contamination from the people it claimed to serve? This is the story of Bell Creameries, a century of extraordinary rise, a slow and festering concealment, and a fall that shook the entire American food industry. Welcome inside the Little Creamery in Brenham, where the ice cream was always cold and the secrets ran even deeper. August 1907, Brenham, Texas. The town sat 70 miles northwest of Houston, nestled in Washington County, where the rolling pastureland turned emerald green after spring rains, and the air carried the earthy sweetness of dairy farms stretching to the horizon. It was a farming community, modest and hard-working, built on the labor of people who rose before dawn and measured the value of a day by what their hands produced. A group of local businessmen gathered with a straightforward idea. Dairy farmers in the region were producing more cream than the market could absorb. That excess cream represented wasted money, spoiled potential, lost income for families who could not afford the loss. The solution these men proposed was to convert a nearby abandoned cotton gin into a creamery, a place where that surplus cream could be purchased, processed, and turned into saleable butter. The Brenham Creamery Company was incorporated on August 3, 1907, and it set to work immediately. For the first 4 years, butter was all they made. The ice cream arrived almost as an afterthought in 1911, produced by hand-cranking 2 gallons a day inside a wooden tub packed with ice. 2 gallons, the kind of quantity you could make in your own kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. A horse and wagon carried those modest portions to neighbors nearby, and most people barely noticed. Back then, nearly every household made their own ice cream anyway. There was no reason to believe this operation would become anything significant. But word spread, and word in a small Texas town travels with surprising velocity. By 1916, the company was struggling financially, and changing management had failed to reverse the slide. The board considered closing the doors entirely. The creamery had survived less than a decade and already appeared to be dying. What saved it was a single hiring decision that would alter the trajectory of one of America's most beloved food companies. The problem was this. No one who ran the creamery in those early years seemed to understand that a struggling enterprise needed not just management, but belief. It needed someone willing to bleed for it. In 1919, the board reached out to a 23-year-old former schoolteacher named E.F. Cruz. That decision would transform everything, but the transformation would not come easily or cheaply, and it would demand a kind of sacrifice that is rarely seen in American business history. April 1st, 1919, Brenham, Texas. The day E.F. Cruz walked through the doors of the Brenham Creamery Company, the business was hemorrhaging money. The books were a study in despair. The equipment was aging. The workforce was skeletal. Only 4 employees remained, plus Cruz himself. The salary the board had offered him was $70 a month, a reasonable wage for a young man in that era. He did not cash a single paycheck for 6 months. Elmer Frederick Cruz made that calculation deliberately. He understood that if the company could not cover basic operational costs without the burden of his salary, then he would simply not burden it. He would carry the weight of his own poverty rather than watch the enterprise collapse under it. It was an act of stunning personal sacrifice, and it set the tone for everything that followed. E.F. Cruz was not just managing a creamery, he was building a philosophy. Under his stewardship, the company expanded its ice cream production into the surrounding Brenham area and slowly but steadily returned to solvency. He purchased the company's first motorized vehicle, extending the delivery radius and opening new markets that the horse-drawn wagon could never reach. He invested carefully. He grew cautiously. And in 1930, in a gesture that revealed as much about the man as any business decision could, he renamed the company. He chose to call it Bell Creameries, after the Texas bluebell wildflower, his personal favorite, a purple bloom that erupted across the pastures of Washington County in spring, as native to this land as the people who worked it. The name was not chosen for marketing reasons. There was no advertising agency involved, no focus group, no consultants. E.F. Cruz simply loved that flower. He loved the land it represented. He wanted his company to carry that identity. In 1936, 2 purchases transformed the creamery's capacity. The first was a refrigerated truck, which meant ice cream could travel farther without melting, opening markets that had previously been physically impossible to reach. The second was a continuous ice cream freezer, capable of producing 80 gallons per hour. Before this machine, production ran in 10-gallon batches every 20 minutes. This was a revolution in scale. E.F. Cruz ran the company until 1951. Then cancer arrived, and 8 weeks later, he was gone. What happened next would determine whether his legacy survived him or dissolved without him. 1951, Brenham, Texas. Ed and Howard Cruz had grown up inside this company. Not metaphorically, literally. In 1941, when Ed was 13 years old and Howard was younger still, both boys had begun working part-time at the plant during summers. Ed made ice cream sandwiches by hand, quartering 2-gallon blocks, slicing them into portions, pressing Nabisco cookies around each one, and bagging them one by one before they could melt. Howard helped prepare fresh peaches for blending into ice cream bases. They were children learning a craft by doing it, guided by a father who believed deeply that excellence could not be inherited. It had to be earned with your hands. Both brothers went on to study dairy science at Texas A&M University. Both returned to the company. And when E.F. Cruz died in 1951, Ed Cruz stepped into leadership at the same age his father had, 23 years old. History had arranged itself into a kind of echo. Under the second Cruz generation, the company underwent a strategic transformation. In 1958, Bluebell permanently halted all butter production. The company that had been founded specifically to make butter now committed itself entirely and irreversibly to ice cream. This was not a small decision. It was an elimination of a product line that had existed since the first day of operation. It was a bet on identity. The bet paid off. Through the 1960s, expansion into the Houston market proved the pivotal test. Bluebell's salesmen had been warned explicitly by industry veterans that a small-town Texas brand had no business competing against more than 10 established ice cream companies in a major urban market. The common wisdom was brutal and direct. A country ice cream cannot survive in a city. But Bluebell became the best-selling ice cream in Houston by the mid-1970s. Not despite its country identity, but because of it. In a city that was urbanizing rapidly, there was enormous emotional appetite for something that felt rooted, honest, and local. The Little Creamery in Brenham had accidentally discovered one of the most powerful forces in consumer psychology. Then, in 1969, they created the flavor that would define them for generations. It was called homemade vanilla. 2 years in development, engineered to taste exactly like ice cream made the old-fashioned way, hand-cranked, unhurried, impossibly pure. It would become the best-selling single ice cream flavor in the United States by 1997. But that triumph was still decades away, and the road there would require building something far larger than anyone in Brenham had yet imagined. 1980, Brenham, Texas. The numbers were staggering in the context of where the company had started. By 1980, Bluebell was producing over 10 million gallons of ice cream annually and generating $30 million in revenue. This was a company that had once measured its daily output in gallons you could count on 2 hands. The transformation, over 73 years, was almost incomprehensible. The expansion of the 1980s was systematic and disciplined. Manufacturing plants opened in Alvin, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Longview, and Waco between 1980 and 1986. These were not distribution centers. These were full production facilities, extending the company's capacity and reducing the distance ice cream had to travel to stay frozen and fresh. Bluebell's obsession with freshness was not marketing language. The company used milk sourced from approximately 60,000 cows each day, and that milk was always less than 24 hours old when it entered production. Company executives were known to boast that the milk was so fresh it had been grass only yesterday. In 1989, Bluebell crossed into Oklahoma for the first time, establishing distribution branches in Oklahoma City and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The expansion model was precise and deliberately unhurried. Before entering any new market, company executives conducted thorough research, ensured all employees in that market were fully trained to Bluebell standards, and prepared logistics for direct store delivery, a system where only Bluebell employees handled the product from factory to freezer shelf. No middlemen, no brokers. Personal accountability at every step. By 1992, the company reached the number 2 position in national ice cream sales, trailing only Breyers, despite selling its products in less than a quarter of the country's geography. That same year, a second manufacturing facility opened in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. In 1996, a third facility opened in Sylacauga, Alabama. The company now had production capacity across 3 states. Sales in 1992 reached $170 million. Market share in Texas stood at 57%. In Oklahoma and Louisiana combined, it held 32%. These were the numbers of a dominant regional force, a company that had chosen depth over breadth and won on both accounts. Here's what nobody saw coming. The expansion would eventually stop. Not because the market wasn't there, not because the demand wasn't real, but because the company's greatest strength, its culture of careful, slow growth, would eventually collide with pressures it was not designed to survive. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We're just getting into the heart of this story, and it only gets more intense from here. 1997, Brenham, Texas. In that year, the homemade vanilla flavor that Howard and Ed Cruz had spent 2 years perfecting back in 1969 became officially the best-selling single flavor of ice cream in the entire United States. Not the best-selling Bluebell flavor, not the best-selling Texas ice cream, the single best-selling individual ice cream flavor in the country. That achievement, for a privately held company in a small Texas town, was nothing short of extraordinary. The brand had become something deeper than a product. Bluebell had woven itself into the fabric of Southern life with a persistence and intimacy that multinational corporations spent hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to manufacture and almost never achieved. People in Texas did not merely buy Bluebell. They served it at birthday parties and holidays, packed it into church potlucks, handed their children their first taste as a kind of initiation into Texas identity. Former Governor and President George W. Bush had Bluebell regularly shipped to Camp David during his administration. In 2006 and again in 2012, astronauts aboard the International Space Station were treated to Bluebell ice cream, specifically to help the crew's happiness quotient. If that is not cultural penetration, nothing is. In 2001, Forbes magazine named Bluebell the best ice cream in America. In 2006, New York Times food writer R.W. Apple Jr. traveled to Brenham and wrote about the ice cream's clean flavors and luxuriant texture, praising it for lacking the cloying sweetness and oily aftertaste that afflicted most mass-manufactured competitors. The review read like a love letter. Bluebell introduced its flagship cookies and cream flavor and was widely credited as the first company to mass-produce the combination. It kept its standard containers at a full half-gallon, 64 fluid ounces, at a time when competitors across the industry were quietly shrinking their containers to 48 or 56 ounces while maintaining the same price. Bluebell mentioned this distinction prominently in its advertising, and consumers noticed. It felt like honesty. It felt like respect. The in-house advertising agency, established in 1987, produced seasonal campaigns that reinforced the Little Creamery in Brenham identity with remarkable consistency. The logo of the girl and the cow, introduced in 1977, became one of the most recognizable symbols in American regional food marketing. But the brand that Texans called home was, beneath its wholesome surface, already sitting on a foundation with cracks that no one in Brenham was willing to acknowledge, or willing to fix. 2013, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Inside Bluebell's second production facility, a quiet drama had begun. Not in the boardrooms, not in the executive suites, but on the factory floors, in the drainage systems beneath the equipment, in the spaces between the machines where condensation accumulated and dripped silently downward. In March of 2013, Bluebell's own testing protocols began finding something they were not supposed to find: Listeria monocytogenes. The bacteria had appeared in the Broken Arrow facility, identified on surfaces including floors, catwalks, and equipment contact areas. Listeria is one of the most dangerous foodborne pathogens known to science. It thrives in cold environments, which means a frozen food manufacturing facility, the very environment Bluebell operated, is not a deterrent, but an incubator. Listeria does not die when you freeze it. It waits. Between March of 2013 and February of 2015, Bluebell's own internal testing confirmed the presence of Listeria on 17 separate occasions in the Broken Arrow plant alone. 17 times. That is not a contamination. That is a colony. And yet, the company did not notify the FDA of these findings. Not once. It did not launch a comprehensive investigation into how the bacteria were entering the facility. It did not shut down production. It did not recall products. Instead, according to court records that would emerge years later, CEO Paul Cruz was informed of presumptive positive Listeria test results, and he ordered the quality control team to stop further testing and to destroy both hard copy and electronic records of those results. The decision to suppress the testing data was not the mistake of a panicked junior employee. It was a directive from the top. The reasoning, such as it was, appeared to be rooted in protecting the company's carefully constructed public identity. Blue Bell's brand was built entirely on the promise of purity. The slogan was the best ice cream in the country. A contamination disclosure would shatter that image. The calculation, devastating in its callousness, was this: containment over transparency. Meanwhile, in a hospital in Wichita, Kansas, patients were drinking milkshakes made from Blue Bell's Institutional Scoops ice cream product. Some of those patients were already weakened by illness. The Listeria they would consume in those milkshakes would kill 3 of them. The company's secret was about to become something far larger than a secret. It was about to become a body count. 2014, Brenham, Texas. While contamination was spreading through the Broken Arrow facility and quietly reproducing in Blue Bell's other plants, the company's public face had never looked more polished or more powerful. In 2014, Blue Bell was ranked by Statista as the best-selling individual ice cream brand in the United States by total revenue, surpassing even the national giants that sold their products in every corner of the country. Blue Bell was available in only 20% of the nation's geography. It was outselling brands available in 100% of it. Estimated revenues for 2014 reached $680 million. The 3 manufacturing facilities, Brenham, Broken Arrow, and Sylacauga, were running at extraordinary capacity. The Brenham plant, which had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1990, was producing over 100 pints per minute. 50 distribution centers, known as branches, operated across a 24-state footprint. The workforce had grown to nearly 4,000 employees. The visitor center and country store at the Brenham headquarters attracted tourists and pilgrims in roughly equal measure. Families drove hours specifically to buy a $1 scoop of ice cream at the source. The observation deck overlooking the production line had become one of the most distinctive industrial tourism attractions in Texas. Blue Bell hosted approximately 117,000 visitors per year at the Brenham facility alone. In the company's Texas home market, 52% of all ice cream sold was Blue Bell. In some Texas cities, that figure climbed even higher. The brand had achieved something that marketers rarely accomplish: genuine emotional belonging. Blue Bell was not merely preferred, it was trusted. But here's the thing about trust. It is not infrastructure. It is not machinery. It is not a balance sheet. It is a living agreement between a company and the people who believe in it. And like all living things, it can die. In Brenham, the executives preparing annual reports and marketing campaigns in 2014 were working hard to sustain that trust. In Broken Arrow and in the Brenham plant itself, the machinery was telling a different story. The condensation was still dripping. The bacteria was still multiplying. And somewhere in South Carolina, a routine government sampling program had just begun testing products that had just come off the Blue Bell production line. The clock was running. February 12, 2015, Columbia, South Carolina. Inspectors from the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control were conducting routine product sampling at a Blue Bell distribution center. It was the kind of check that happened thousands of times each year across the country. Methodical, undramatic, unlikely to produce anything newsworthy. They collected samples from 2 products, a single-serving chocolate chip country cookie sandwich and a Great Divide bar. Both had been manufactured at the Blue Bell facility in Brenham, Texas. The laboratory results returned 3 strains of Listeria monocytogenes, plus 4 additional rare strains. The samples were not ambiguous. The contamination was real and present. South Carolina notified Blue Bell on February 13th. The company learned, for the first time officially, through a government channel it could not suppress, that contaminated product was in the distribution stream. 3 days later, without any public announcement, Blue Bell quietly began retrieving 10 different products made on the same factory line. No press release, no consumer alert, no acknowledgement to the public, to retailers, or to the hospitals and schools that had been served Blue Bell products for years. The FDA and state regulators, reasoning that only a limited number of single-serving institutional products were affected, agreed that a quiet retrieval was initially appropriate. Blue Bell's spokespeople described this process as a precautionary measure. What it actually was, in hindsight, was the beginning of a coordinated effort to limit the information available to the public for as long as operationally possible. On March 9, 2015, Blue Bell received confirmation that the Listeria strains found in South Carolina were genetically identical to the strains linked to deaths in Wichita, Kansas. 3 people were dead. Blue Bell had known about contamination in its Broken Arrow facility for 2 years. It had known about the South Carolina findings for nearly a month. The next day, it stopped production on the affected Brenham line and permanently shut down the specific machine responsible for the tainted products. On March 13, 2015, Blue Bell issued its first-ever public recall in 108 years of operation. Company executives described it as the first recall in the company's history, which was technically accurate and profoundly misleading simultaneously. What the public did not yet know was that this was not the beginning of the crisis. They were being introduced to a crisis that had already been quietly consuming people for 5 years. April 20, 2015, Brenham, Texas. The decision came in the evening, after weeks of partial recalls, corporate statements insisting the situation was contained, and a series of incremental revelations that each proved the previous assurances false. Blue Bell's leadership took the step that had been inevitable since February. CEO Paul Cruz issued a statement announcing a complete, total, voluntary recall of every single Blue Bell product then on the market: ice cream, frozen yogurt, sherbet, frozen snacks, across all 23 states where the brand was sold. 8 million gallons, the entire inventory, all of it. Those 8 million gallons were transported to a sanitary landfill and destroyed. 8 million gallons is enough ice cream to give every person living in the state of Texas more than 3 full pints each. It was the largest product destruction event in the company's history by an incalculable margin. The CDC had by that point confirmed 10 illness cases across 4 states: Arizona, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. All 10 patients had required hospitalization. 3 were dead. And when investigators began tracing the genetic signatures of the Listeria strains backward through time using the PulseNet national database, they found something that stunned even experienced epidemiologists. The contamination had not started in early 2015. It had been present, intermittent, quiet, 1 case per year, since January of 2010. The longest Listeria outbreak the CDC had ever formally tracked. Blue Bell shut all 3 of its manufacturing facilities simultaneously: the Brenham plant, the Broken Arrow facility, the Sylacauga plant. All production halted. All workers sent home. The silence that descended on the factories was total. On May 15, 2015, the announcement that the company had sworn it would never make arrived. In its 108-year history, Blue Bell had never laid off a single worker. That record, too, was over. 1,450 employees, 37% of the entire workforce, received termination notices. Another 1,400 were furloughed without pay. The remaining 1,050 had their wages reduced. 15 of 50 distribution centers were suspended indefinitely. Then the financial reality arrived. Without production, without revenue, and with legal exposure growing by the day, executives warned shareholders they were facing a capital crisis. The company that had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars was staring at the possibility of permanent closure. The best ice cream in the country had run out of time. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to us and helps make stories like this possible. The legal fallout and the long road back are still ahead. July 14th, 2015, Fort Worth, Texas. Sid Richardson Bass was not the kind of man who needed to invest in an ice cream company. The 68-year-old Fort Worth businessman, a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Graduate School of Business, had inherited a family oil and gas empire from his great-uncle Sid Richardson and was estimated by Forbes to have a personal net worth of $1.66 billion. He had spent decades managing long-term investments across multiple industries, including a notable stint working closely with management teams at the Walt Disney Company. What Blue Bell needed was $125 million. What it needed even more was the signal that investment would send, that someone with credibility, capital, and business acumen believed the company was worth saving. Paul Kruse had written a desperate letter to Blue Bell's existing shareholders in May, imploring them to contribute capital and warning that if they could not raise sufficient funds internally, an outside investor would be brought in who would dilute their ownership. The existing shareholders, facing an enterprise in the middle of a federal contamination crisis with criminal investigations circling, declined. The board had no choice but to reach outward. Bass agreed to invest. The terms, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, gave the Bass family a one-third stake in the company in exchange for a loan of up to $125 million. The announcement came on July 14th and immediately changed the narrative from imminent collapse to possible survival. It was the precise opposite of what had destroyed the company. Where Blue Bell had chosen concealment, Bass chose transparency. Where the company's internal culture had prioritized reputation over safety, Bass's team indicated a willingness to rebuild from honest foundations. Terry Heemeyer, who taught crisis management at Rice University, told reporters that without Bass, Blue Bell would have had a far bigger problem and likely could not have moved forward. The money provided breathing room. The rehabilitation of the factories, deep cleaning, equipment replacement, new sanitation protocols, the permanent decommissioning of the Brenham production machine most heavily associated with the contamination, could now proceed. Blue Bell hired external food safety microbiologists. It implemented a test and hold protocol, meaning no batch could be packaged for sale until it tested clean for all bacteria strains. The road back would be long. But for the first time since February, it was at least a road that existed. December 2015, Washington, D.C. CBS Evening News broke the story on December 29th. The United States Department of Justice had launched a formal federal criminal investigation into Bell Creameries. The investigation, conducted by the DOJ's Consumer Protection Branch, was focused on a single, devastating question. What exactly did Blue Bell executives know about the Listeria contamination? When did they know it? And what did they do, or choose not to do, in response? The investigation was led by trial attorney Patrick Hearn, who had recently secured convictions against executives at the Peanut Corporation of America in a separate, similarly catastrophic food safety case. His presence signaled that the DOJ was not conducting a routine review. It was building a criminal case. The factual record, as it would emerge over subsequent years, was damning. Internal documents established that Blue Bell's quality control employees had been raising condensate and leak concerns across all facilities as far back as 2010. In 2011, a quality control employee created an internal program to test finished products showing high coliform results. When that program began finding presumptive positive Listeria results, according to court records, Paul Kruse was informed and ordered quality control to stop the testing entirely. He then instructed another quality control employee to destroy both hard copy and electronic records of those findings. On May 1, 2020, 5 years after the outbreak, Bell Creameries formally entered a guilty plea on 2 misdemeanor counts of distributing adulterated food products in violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The company agreed to pay criminal penalties of $17.5 million plus $2.1 million to resolve False Claims Act allegations related to contaminated products sold to federal facilities, including military installations. The combined total of $19.35 million was the second largest criminal penalty ever paid to resolve a food safety matter in American history at that time. On October 22, 2020, a federal grand jury indicted Paul Crews personally on 7 felony counts, 6 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Each felony carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. The case was filed in the Western District of Texas under the designation United States of America v. Paul Crews. Crews pleaded not guilty. He prepared for trial. And the legal battle over what happened inside those cold factories would stretch across 3 more years of American courts. August 1st, 2022, Austin, Texas. The federal courthouse in Austin became, for 3 weeks in the summer of 2022, the stage for a reckoning that much of Texas had been watching build for 7 years. Paul Crews sat at the defendant's table, facing a jury of his peers, charged with concealing what the company knew about its contaminated products during the critical period between February and April of 2015. The prosecution's case rested on the argument that Crews had deliberately withheld information from consumers, retailers, and the public, that while people were being served Bluebell ice cream in hospital cafeterias, Crews knew those products might be contaminated and chose not to say so. The government called witnesses who testified to Crews's directives to suppress testing and destroy records. They introduced internal communications establishing a timeline of knowledge that preceded the company's belated public disclosures by months and years. Current Bluebell president Richard Dixon, who had been working under Crews at the time of the outbreak, took the stand and testified that Crews had told him the company was not quite ready to come clean about the situation. It was a moment of striking, plain-spoken revelation from inside the company's own leadership. The defense countered that Crews had never intended to defraud anyone, that he had been making crisis decisions under impossible pressure with incomplete information, that Bluebell was a company that had served the American public faithfully for over a century, and that reducing its leadership's response to a deadly outbreak to calculated malice misread the nature of the crisis and the character of the man. The jury deliberated, and then, in a development that the prosecution had not anticipated, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. 10 jurors voted to acquit. 2 voted to convict. A mistrial was declared. Under United States law, a hung jury means neither conviction nor exoneration. It means begin again. The DOJ scheduled a retrial for April of 2023. Then, on March 2, 2023, before the second trial could begin, Paul Crews and federal prosecutors reached a plea agreement. All 7 felony counts were dismissed. Crews pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor charge under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the same category of charge the company itself had pleaded to in 2020, and agreed to pay a fine of $100,000. No prison time. The passport that had been held for 890 consecutive days was returned to him. The legal chapter was closed. What remained was something harder to resolve than a court case. August 31st, 2015, Houston, Texas. Phase 1 of Bluebell's return began. Products reappeared on store shelves in the Houston and Austin markets, and in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, the areas closest to the 2 reopened production facilities. The return was not a triumphant march. It was a cautious, measured reintroduction executed under heavy public scrutiny and the watchful eyes of federal regulators who now required notification of any positive Listeria test result before production could continue. The company's five-phase national relaunch unfolded across the remainder of 2015 and into 2016. Phase 2 brought products back to Dallas-Fort Worth and northern Oklahoma in November. Phases 3 and 4 followed in December. By January 28, 2016, large portions of the southeastern United States had Bluebell back in their freezer aisles. But the geography of the return told a story of permanent loss. Markets including Charlotte, Kansas City, Louisville, Phoenix, and Denver did not see Bluebell restored for years. Some of those markets, Phoenix, Tucson, Denver, were not reopened until March of 2017, nearly 2 years after the shutdown. Indianapolis, Lexington, and Albuquerque did not welcome Bluebell back until March of 2018. Wichita, Kansas, the city where 3 people had died, did not see Bluebell return to stores until mid-April of 2023, 8 years after the outbreak. The brand that had once occupied 24 states with 50 distribution centers had been reduced, rebuilt slowly, painfully, market by market. The company that had never laid off a single worker in a century had cut nearly 1,500 jobs. The company, valued at hundreds of millions, was now partially owned by a billionaire who had had to rescue it from insolvency. And yet, it did not disappear. By 2018, estimated revenues had climbed back to over $500 million. The workforce had grown back to over 1,000 employees. The fan base, particularly in Texas, had not abandoned the brand. If anything, in some quarters, the loyalty had deepened. Texans who had grown up on Bluebell did not want to believe the company was gone. They wanted to believe in redemption. In 2024, Bluebell ran the Great Scoop Revival Tournament, asking fans to vote for their favorite retired flavors to bring back. Millions of people participated. In May of 2025, the beloved Groom's Cake flavor was revived. The Little Creamery in Brenham was still standing, but it was standing differently than it ever had before. Go to Brenham, Texas today and stand on South Bluebell Road. Look at the building that once was an abandoned cotton gin, converted by local farmers into a butter creamery in the summer of 1907, transformed into a national ice cream institution across 118 years of continuous family ownership. The Art Moderne facade still stands. The observation deck is still open Monday through Friday. The country store still sells a scoop for $1. And somewhere inside, the machines are still running. If you visit that facility today and watch the ice cream moving through the packaging line, you might easily believe the story ended happily. The brand is alive. The product is back. The legal cases are resolved. But linger a little longer, and the weight of what happened here, the weight of 3 deaths, 8 million gallons of destroyed product, 1,450 jobs eliminated overnight, 5 years of concealment, settles over the scene like a cold front that never quite passes. What Bluebell's story teaches, implicitly and undeniably, is this: reputation is not the same as integrity. Bluebell spent decades constructing one of the most beloved brand identities in American food history. The Little Creamery, the best ice cream in the country, the girl and the cow. But when the moment arrived that tested whether the company's actual practices matched its constructed image, the gap between the two proved catastrophic. A brand built entirely on the promise of purity had been concealing contamination for years. The reputation held until it could not. And when it failed with deadly consequences. Transparency delayed is transparency denied. The decision to suppress test results, destroy records, and manage the contamination quietly rather than immediately and fully was not a single moment of bad judgment. It was a sustained institutional posture. Bluebell's culture of careful, deliberate growth had somewhere crossed a line into a culture of careful, deliberate silence. Every day that silence extended was a day more vulnerable people consumed the product. 3 of them did not survive. Loyalty is real, and loyalty is finite. The most striking element of Blue Bell's story is not the fall. It is that the company survived it. The loyalty of its consumer base, particularly in Texas, proved resilient enough to outlast the crisis. But that loyalty came with a permanent asterisk. The markets that were never fully restored, the employees who were never rehired, the cities where the Blue Bell freezer section remained empty for years. Blue Bell produced over 10 million gallons of ice cream annually by 1980. It reached estimated revenues of $680 million in 2014. It operated for 108 years without a single public recall before 2015. And then, in a matter of 60 days, it lost nearly everything it had spent a century building. The ice cream is still cold in Brenham. The cows are still grazing on the rolling pastures of Washington County. The question that cannot be refrigerated, the one that lingers long after the last scoop is finished, is simple and permanent. How much of what we are told to trust has already been quietly contaminated, and who is still choosing not to say so?